Hello, and welcome to the first tier list of commanders that I am making. I will be going through all the factions, and I will be going through all the commanders and rating them depending on their power level. Both in 1v1s and team games. I mostly play 1v1, so that's where my perception of their power level comes from. But I have played my fair share of team games as well, and I will try to take those into consideration as well. Of course, I will also be mentioning which situation these commanders excel at, when they are useful, when they're less so. And today we will be looking at the Soviet roster of commanders and rating them. Alright, so first up we have the Advanced Warfare Tactics, which is the first commander we'll be taking a look at. It has the T-34-85s, it has some Conscript buffs with Conscript repair kit, as well as the PPSHs, as well as a strafe. Now I find this to be one of the more lackluster Soviet commanders. It does have the T-34-85, which is nice, I suppose, but the PPSHs and Conscript repair kits are generally not very useful, as Soviets you generally go for double engineer, and the Conscript repairs themselves are really slow, so that's not very useful. The strafe in this commander is not very good either. It's just a strafe. Other than that, there's better doctrines to pick over this in majority of situations, I do believe. It's still useful, but there is a lot better options than this one, which means we're just gonna rate this very low tier, down in C. And next up we have, of course, the Airborne troop tactics, which is the most recent Soviet commander added to the roster. It's seen a fair share of nerfs since its release, but this is probably still one of the best doctrines you can ever pick. It comes with the SVTs, it comes with the Dushka. It of course has those small rally points that you don't really see that often, but that's not really where the power level is. It's just in the general package, whereas the Soviet, being more of a late game focused faction, generally its power level really starts to shine in the late game. This doctrine just allows it to reach that late game a bit faster. The power spikes with this doctrine comes a bit earlier. You don't have to wait for the 7-man crews. You can drop those SVTs, and in team games, if you have a Soviet ally, you can drop them SVTs as well. If you have like a USF ally, you can drop them a Dushka. If they go captain, they still have machine guns. It's just a very strong doctrine. In the late game, you of course have the IL-2 rocket run, which has been probably one of the more controversial abilities in the game, where people dislike the fact that it can essentially delete vehicles, and this has also been one of the reasons why the RAM was nerfed quite recently. Even so, I still find this doctrine to be absolutely S tier across the board. It's amazing in team games, it's amazing in 1v1s, and it's just really what shines in the Soviet faction. So we're gonna drop this up to S tier. Alright. And then, of course, next up we have the anti-infantry tactics, which comes with the KV-8, the shock troops, the recon, and the fear propaganda artillery, which essentially forces units to retreat. And it's a very unique doctrine in the Soviet roster, it has some meme potential here. Though, to be fair, the power level of this is not very strong. It has a decent package. You got shock troops, you got recon, and you got some different off-map abilities with a lot of spiciness, if you may. But the general package isn't amazing. This is not a 1v1 commander, that's for sure, except if you're going for some meme strats. In team games I see this being way more useful. The retreat paths are generally longer. If you hit this on a couple of 80 guns for instance, they're gonna be off the field for a couple of minutes if you manage to roll the retreat. It's just an okay doctrine at best, but it's definitely not useless, and it has a decent package, which means that we are gonna bring this to B tier. And next up, we of course have the Armored Assault Tactics, which is one of the IS-2 doctrines. The IS-2 generally isn't really in a good spot right now. It's sort of considered to be quite weak, but at the end of the day it's still one heavy tank. It's not a brain AFK move to pick an IS-2 up. It's very special situation, which might not be easy to recognize. I don't think it's useless. I think it's quite viable, but generally this doctrine, it's about all the other abilities, right? You have a IL-2 loiter, which is just very nice. It's not one of the best loiters in the game, but it's still skill planes, and it's still quite nice to have that option. You also have the vehicle crew repairs, which is just one of the better Soviet abilities to have. Just to be able to repair if your T-70 gets snared, or if you have a T-34 deep, you can just repair it without using engineers. Quite useful. You also get the T-34-85s, which are a valid option. I think they are quite strong, and they really add to the Soviet roster. Radio intercept, of course, is useful differently. It's not as useful in team games, I would say, but in 1v1s, it's just a very nice ability to have to get those vehicle timings down so you don't get surprised. Generally, quite a strong doctrine, I would say. Across the board, it has a very nice package, which means we're gonna put this up to A tier at least. And next up, we have the Conscript support tactics. I'm not a fan of this doctrine, I'm gonna say that out loud straight away. It has 3 different conscript oriented abilities, but they're all kind of considered bad, at least in my opinion. They are not very useful. As we mentioned, the conscript repair kits and the PPSH, it also has the rapid conscription, which is just a meme ability, right, straight up and down. It does have that incendiary off map, but even then there's better doctrines where that ability, you can have access to that. It also has the KV1. And the KV1 of course is amazing, but this is by far the worst doctrine where you have access to it. So I would say this is just straight up bad because of the fact that there's other KV1 doctrines, and this one doesn't really add anything interesting or fresh to the table. So it's a straight up B tier for me. Or even C actually, considering there's better KV1 doctrines that are just straight up better. Right, and next up we have the quite famous Counterattack tactics. You can even see I've got it equipped here in my loadout actually. I'm a big fan of this doctrine. It's a lot of fun and it's quite strong as well. You get access to 5 abilities, which all of them are actually very useful. Of course, this is another KV1 doctrine, but it's definitely one of the better ones. It does have the shock troops as well, the recon, which is just nice to have, especially when you come to the 5th ability, which is the B4. I see this being used in team games, I see this being used in 1v1s, and the fact that it has that flavor with the meme B4, which isn't always a meme either. Sometimes you land those hits and it's just that psychological effect as well. You also have for Mother Russia, which is just a great combat bonus buff. It also gives sprint until you get into combat. It's just a good doctrine. Definitely probably not S tier, but it's quite close to S tier. It's like S minus, A plus, I would say. So let's just bring it up to A, because we want to keep the S tier to be the best of the best. And I think there is a better one than this, which we will soon come around to that really deserves the S spot, and I do not think Counterattack Tactics quite has that final oomph to really get up there. Next up we have the Defensive Tactics, which is just an overall amazing commander, though I will admit I can see this being less useful in team games. It is certainly very strong. It has all the support weapons you need, really, which means you can go tier 1 with this, you can go sniper with this, and still have access to all the support weapons that you might need. Personally, I prefer to still go tier 2 just to have access to assist gun, for instance, but if you really want that sniper, or if you're really feeling a penal build today, this is definitely one of the commanders to look at. Apart from all the support weapons, you also get access to the anti-personnel mines, which you can really spam with your engineers. Most Soviet builds generally go double engineer anyway, just to be able to use some of your munitions. And with this doctrine you can really get some cheeky wipes, spamming those on retreat paths or around the VPs. They're generally a bit more cost effective, I found, than the Ost-tier S-mines. Because you don't really have to make those patches, where the Ost-tier S-mines, they become kind of predictable. Of course, these don't really put any signs either to show where they are, and they can be very difficult to swipe, because even with a sweeper you can't really see the mines, which makes them very sneaky. It also has the anti-tank overwatch, which is an amazing off-map for Soviets. If you get to the late game, your T-34-76s can be quite dangerous even to heavier targets with the off-map such as these. I may have forgotten to mention it when I went over the Airborne as well, but with the IL-2 and the T-34 you can just ram and really destroy any heavier vehicle, and the same goes here. If you have a sys gun lined up as well, that usually means that's a dead vehicle, which just gives it a lot of power throughout the game, both early to late game. Which means this is another S-tier commander, in my opinion. Of course, if you look at team games, I would probably lower this. I'm not sure how far, probably even to B tier, but just straight up 1v1s, this is definitely up here. Alright, next up we have the Guard Motor Coordination Tactics. This thing has probably been viable throughout since the release of the game. It's just a really strong doctrine. You have the T-34-85s, you have the guard rifles, the repairs, and of course the Mark vehicle. It's just a good package for a commander, where you see spikes both early and mid with useful abilities, which is nice. I do not think this is S tier. It's not exceptional, it's not like overpowered by any means, it's just good, it's just very good, which means we're gonna put this baby to A tier. Alright, next up we have the Guard Rifle Combined Arms Tactics. Has probably the longest name, but not only that, it's another KV1 doctrine, and this one is the better one in my opinion. Not only do you get access to KV1, you get the guard rifles instead of the shocks from the Counterattack Tactics. You also have the ML20, which is nice in team games sometimes, not always. Usually gets outshined by the left edge, and of course Soviets has access to Katyushas, so it's not an amazing artillery piece, but it also has the skill plane loiter. So it's just a good combination. With the KV1 you have the skill planes, you can make grand pushes with the KV1, and the guards, these three commander slots are they're just really good together in a single package, which makes this another S tier commander. And next up we have one of the major team game doctrines. We have the ISU 152 commander, most commonly known as. It's of course called Mechanized Support Tactics. It does have those ambush sysguns, which is quite nice. You can cloak your sysguns. You also have the guards, a marked vehicle, and an IL-2 strafe. This is not what it used to be. In the last patch, we had a nerf to both ISU doctrines, where the bomber IL-2 bomber ability got removed and changed with the strafe. It's not a very good strafe, which actually hit this commander quite hard, because the bombing could be used in a lot of different ways. You could use them with button from the guards to kill vehicles, or you could, you know, take out a artillery piece. It's just a bit shameful, I think. At the same time, I can see a change was needed, because this package in team games were generally just way too strong. Right now I think it's a good doctrine. It doesn't see any play whatsoever in 1v1s, but for team games it's definitely up there. It's not S tier anymore, I would say, but we might see this coming back later on, depending on how other doctrines get changed. We might see some fresh new synergy. We will see. Currently though, not S tier, but definitely not bad. Alright, next up we have none other than the NKVD, Rifle Disruption Tactics. This doctrine is another one of the KV8 flamethrower doctrines. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not really a fan of the KV8. I think the KV1 just outshines it straight up. It's not useless though, I will admit, and this doctrine has some really strong other abilities, which are very, very much filled with flavor in the commissars, and you got the Scorched Earth. It also has access to the anti-tank Overwatch, which is of course nice for late game if you get a couple T-3476s. I do not actually think this doctrine is bad. It might be a bit underused, if anything, but yeah, I think there is meme potential. I think there is some strength here. If it's enough to bring it up to A tier, it's hard to argue. Just to be safe, I would put this in B tier, both for team games and for 1v1s, which I think is where it really belongs. But it's not too far off from A tier. It's an A minus B plus, but in order to make it stand a bit moderate, we're just gonna bring it down to B tier. And next up we have another one filled with flavor. It's the Partisan Tactics, of course, which comes with the different partisans. This is another one that's being up for change in the patch, so we will revisit this after the commander patch. Currently though, I think this is a very interesting doctrine. You of course have the map hack in the spy network, which is very nice. You have the tank hunters, which is just quite useful unit actually, to spawn in behind the lines, and maybe you can finish off a vehicle. Maybe you can spam a couple ones and just hide them, so you get a couple and then you can get a volley off. Of course also has the snare and the mark vehicle, which is nice with the partisan tank hunters. Probably more of a team game doctrine, where there's more garrisons generally, and you get more usefulness out of the spy network. Also has more targets for the mark vehicle, of course, in team games. For 1v1s, it's not as useful. It's certainly meme value, but the strength isn't really quite there. We'll see what's gonna happen to this after the changes, but currently I think this is about as B tier as you can get. It probably defines the entire row here, I believe. Next up we have none other than the Shock Motor Heavy Tactics, which is another ISU doctrine. It has the shock troops, it has of course the strafe. This also used to have the bombing run that the other one had, the Mechanized Support Tactics, but it got also swapped out with the nerf from the latest patch, which definitely softened this power level a bit. Usually this doctrine has been quite outshined by the mechanized support tactics because guards are generally more valuable than shocks. You also have the ambush, and the armored vehicle detection isn't quite useful. As you can see, both of these doctrines do not have access to the marked vehicle. I don't know why, but I thought this also had that. I was quite wrong. Generally, you don't see this doctrine as often, but it's a nice substitute if you have multiple people going ISU, I suppose. Other than that, you could say it's map dependent, but I don't really think it is. I think you pick this doctrine over this pretty much every time, which is gonna lower the power, or gonna lower my perception of this doctrine, because there's just a straight up better option, which means we're gonna drop this down to B tier. Alright, and next up we have the second IS-2 commander, the Shock Rifle Frontline Tactics. This is another quite strong doctrine in my opinion. The KV-8 you can pretty much ignore, but you have the ambush, you have shock, you have the off map, and you have IS-2 late game if you feel like you need it. As previously mentioned, the IS-2 is not in an amazing spot, but it's still a decent package, I think. You can definitely argue this is better than the package from Armored Assault. It's really up to your own personal preference, I believe. But overall, I think these two doctrines are about the same power level, and therefore we're gonna evaluate it as such, bringing it up to A tier. The next doctrine is one of the 4 mustache men that the Soviets has. This is Soviet Combined Arms Army. This is actually not a bad doctrine, probably more of a team focused or team game focused doctrine. It's one of those that still has the IL-2 bombing strike, which the ISU doctrines used to have, which means this is quite nice in team games, because then you still have that off map that can take out a vehicle or take out the left edge or whatever you're really aiming at, maybe a Schwer. Just a nice doctrine. You have guards, you have the recon, and you have the sys gun camouflage. You also have the access to the ML20 if you feel like you need one. Like I mentioned earlier, usually you don't. You usually prefer a Katusha in most circumstances. But if you are struggling with fuel, this is a bit cheaper than a Katusha fuel-wise. Makes it an option. Definitely not a bad commander. We're gonna put this up to A tier. And next up we have the Homan, the Soviet Industry Tactics. This is the first KV-2 doctrine which we are looking at. The KV-2 I think is probably one of the best heavy tanks in the game, if you disqualify the KV-1. It's just generally quite nice to have. It can still dash out some amazing damage from afar. It can still tangle with vehicles. You also have the vehicle crew repairs, which is nice, and you have some fuel drops to get that KV-2 a bit faster. Repair stations are nice, I suppose, in team games, not quite as commonly seen in 1v1s. So I think this is a proper doctrine. I think this might get a bit outshined by another doctrine, which we will see quite soon, which means we're gonna put this into B tier for now. And next up we have the generic Mustache Man number 2. It's of course Soviet Reserve Army, which is the second doctrine that has access to any kind of partisans. Of course, subject to change in the coming patch. We are not discussing that here, we're only discussing the current power level. And currently this doctrine is not very good. It's heavily outshined by the other partisan doctrine if you want partisans. And considering the way we evaluated the other partisan doctrine, this one is just straight up worse. It has 2 abilities that are quite, or even 3 abilities that are arguably quite useless, which is of course the Conscript repair kit and the rapid conscription, as well as the PPSHs. I mentioned these before, I don't think either of one of them deserves a ability slot, they're all quite useless. The Conscript repair kit is interesting, but it just doesn't work because it's too slow. You have the engineers, the PPSHs are just, I don't know, it's just, they're quite bad. 7-man preferred all day, every day, no matter what map it is, no matter what game mode you're playing, it's just better. You have the ML20, but once again, it's just CoH2 is a better option in almost every scenario. Which means this is another C tier commander for us. Next up we have the generic Mustacheman number 3, which is the Soviet shock army. It has access to the 120 mil shock mortar, shock troops, another PPSH, as well as a loiter actually this time around, which is nice. I mean, it's interesting. It's not really a 1v1 oriented commander, but in team games, sure, I don't think it's a bad pick. It's not a good pick either, but it's not completely uselessness. It's slightly better at least than the pre-mentioned Doctrine, which means we're at least gonna bring this up to B. But there's nothing amazing here, there's nothing spectacular. It's just not bad, not good. Not really anything, it's okay. Next up we have quite an interesting doctrine though. It's filled with flavor, that's for sure. It's a very fun, probably one of the most meme doctrines for Soviets, if not in the game. It's of course the dang Countertactics, which gives the conscripts access to the PTRS package, which allows them to camouflage and also gives them access to stronger anti-tank grenades. Also gives them free PTRSs, which makes them completely dog shit at fighting infantry. Also has some of those USF anti-vehicle mines, which stuns the mines, which might allow you to sprint up and throw those grenades, which can really delete vehicles if you get in range. Other than that, it's not really amazing doctrine. It has access to a different anti-tank run than the one we've seen before, whereas the other one is generally considered a bit stronger, I believe, at least from my perception. You don't see this doctrine very often, but when you see it, you always get kind of happy and your body fills with joy because it's just very, very flavorful commander. But when it comes to power level, not much so, not even in team games. But I'm still gonna put this to B tier because I want to see this doctrine more often. Alright, and next up we have the final generic Mustacheman, which is Terror Tactics. It's not very generic though, because it has access to some unique abilities here. You got the Fear Propaganda Artillery again, which is nice. You have another Bombing Strike, which is very nice. Not the amazing doctrine by any means, but it's definitely useful. You also have the KV8, which again, I'm not a fan of it. You can kind of ignore it, but in certain scenarios where you're far ahead, it's still a nice vehicle to have access to really finish off those games where you're just dominating. Other than that, you have the ML20, but you know, CoH2, it's okay, it's not bad, it's a B tier doctrine for me. Boink, and here we go, the final doctrine for Soviets, which is Urban Defense Tactics. It's the second doctrine which has access to the smaller M4280 guns, which means you can go sniper with this, or penal if you want. You can go tier 1 essentially and still have access to an 80 gun, which is very nice. It also has the forward HQ, which is a bit controversial. People kind of hate that ability, but at the end of the day it's still kind of useful. I don't think it's too cheesy or anything, it's just nice. It's both useful in 1v1s and team games. You also have the KV2, and this is the doctrine I was referring to when I was talking about the Soviet industry tactics. I think urban defense just outshines that doctrine tenfold. There's a lot more useful abilities in urban defense. And not only do you have the forward HQ or the baby 80 guns, you also have the shock troops, which is just very nice. And the booby traps are not as useful, but they can still be used. Whereas certain abilities here, you don't really see that often, from my experience at least. Maybe you guys disagree with me, let me know. But personally, I think this is just a straight up better Doctrine. Which means we're gonna move this baby boy up to A tier for me. And that pretty much summarizes my perception of the commanders in CoH2 for the Soviet faction. Let me know what you guys think. Am I completely off here? Am I right? I don't know. Personally, this is how I would view the power level. Of course, it does change from situation to situation. Certain commanders could probably be moved a bit depending on which game mode you're playing. I can see this commander, for instance, might even drop down to B tier if we're playing strictly 4v4s. It's really up for debate, I think. But in general, this is how I would put them pretty much every day of the week. And that's all for me. I will of course I'm gonna visit the other factions. Next up is Ost here, which will be coming out in a couple days. And then we'll continue with the Western Front factions and of course Brits. We'll go through them all in order. But that's it for Soviets. Bye bye.